I think you handled all those names very well. I knew we needed a historian if we're going to have such a historic reading. So, I'm often asked to pray at civic events. And I always feel just a little bit of ambiguity about it. What's my proper role if I'm praying at the state legislature? Or I've prayed at a mayor's inauguration, or I'm speaking at a Memorial Day parade? I'm not comfortable just going out and kind of blessing the status quo when I might have some moral reservations about what they're doing. I want to call a legislator to their best and highest ideals, but always feel like there's maybe room for a little prophetic challenge. Don't be selfish. Don't disrespect your opposition. If I'm speaking at Memorial Day, I want to honor service and sacrifice and bravery, but yet I don't want it to slip over into justifying every war and violence. Last time I was at the Maine legislature, I read words from Lincoln's second inaugural address in 1865. With malice towards none, with charity for all, with firmness to the right as God gives us to see the right, let us to strive to finish the work we are in, to bind the nation's wounds. I'm not sure they all paid attention. And the question I'm asking here isn't about separation of church and state or freedom of religion. That's going to be next week. This sermon is asking, where do we stand in this culture? Jesus prayed for his disciples at the Last Supper. He said, may they be in the world, but not of the world. He didn't say withdraw into your separatist enclaves away from others or into monastic communities, but be engaged with the world in mission, do justice and love kindness and go and make disciples. But what does it mean to not be of this world? Can we recognize when we have pursued power to the extent that we act more like Caesar than a Galilean fisherman? When Billy Graham preached early in the 1950s, his revival strategy was to proclaim the end times. A great tribulation was coming. It might be nuclear war. It might be the takeover of godless communists. And in Graham's early preaching, politics didn't really matter because, well, the world was going to hell anyway. And I always found it interesting that then Graham cultivated political leaders, presidents, the Queen of England, really more than any other religious leader of his time. And then now his son, Franklin, speaks more about gaining political power for Jesus than he does about the end times or heaven and hell like his father. And evangelicalism is now at the seat of American democracy and power. Sometimes they talk about patriotism, and being an American is the same thing as being a Christian, that God's will and American greatness are aligned as one thing. And mainline Protestantism has had its own path, and for much of American history, those of us in mainline Protestantism have assumed that we were at the center, at the moral core of America. And why wouldn't we? Like, we're here in New England where, the Congregational church was always the first church in the center of the town. You had to have a church in order to have a town in most of New England. So we've been at that center for a couple of centuries. But somewhere along the line around the 1960s and 70s, mainline Protestants realized that a lot of people in America were left out of the center. Black Americans, Native Americans, women, LGBTQ folks. And for the past 50 years, I think mainline Protestants like ours have worked to try to be more welcoming of those who are excluded from the American dream, to build a more just and inclusive society. And I believe that's been the right thing to do. And at the same time, I think we need to acknowledge that with our strength comes a temptation. As we've worked to shape the culture, sometimes we've forgotten to let Christ shape us. We've become so fluent in the language of our culture that our distinctive Christian voice has grown quieter. We've worked hard to help America become a nation we believed it could be. But we haven't always asked, but what kind of church are we becoming? Our spiritual formation has suffered, and in trying to be so relevant, we have lost relevance. So how should the church relate to our American culture in this moment? And as our society becomes more secular and it becomes more polarized, there's the push to join in kind of a culture war mindset. And I think it's time for us to ask some deeper questions. It's not just about what America should be, but what does it mean to be Christian in such a time as this? Sometimes I feel very patriotic, proud to be an American. And then I have another foot that stands in the prophetic tradition and the Sermon on the Mount. And I think that calls us to repentance, to speak up. How do I faithfully give to American Caesars what belongs to Caesar, but to God what belongs to God? How do I live in this culture but not be of it, not be too absorbed and uncritical of it? So in scriptural history, people live in such a wide range of relationships to their culture. Abraham and Sarah leave their home in Ur, and they become migrants, and they live in many different foreign lands. Their descendants become slaves in Egypt. After years of wilderness, they finally are able to get their own kingdom in the land of Judea, and David and Solomon were the great kings, and that is often seen as that's the golden era. But it was only 90 years. And then the northern kingdom splits, and then Assyria comes and takes over the northern kingdom, and then Babylon takes Jerusalem, and they burn the city, and they take all of the elites off into exile. And then comes Persia, and then Greece, and then Rome. By the time we get to Jesus, who's standing in the temple, Israel has been living under someone else's empire for 6 centuries. They don't know anything else. And what that means is when we read the Bible, whether it's the Psalms, the Gospels, the letters of Paul, all of it is written by people who did not control their political fate. They weren't writing from the top. They were writing from the underneath. They were coming from an experience of exile. And Jewish exiles in Babylon, as we're reading the book of Daniel, they had to hold 2 things in tension. The prophet Jeremiah said to the exiles, when you go to Babylon, build homes, plant fields, live there, seek the welfare of the city, engage in the culture that is there, don't withdraw from it. And Daniel and his generation and his companions, they did exactly that. They actually served King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, and they were in the imperial bureaucracy. They even took Babylonian names. I mean, did you think Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were good Jewish names? They had assimilated completely into the Babylonian culture. But then Nebuchadnezzar becomes anxious. Anxious emperors put out loyalty tests. Nebuchadnezzar builds this golden statue that rivals the Colossus of Rhodes, the biggest statue of the ancient world. And he gets the entire court and all the musicians he can find to commemorate his statue. And when the music plays, everyone's supposed to bow. And the penalty, if you don't, is you're going to get thrown into the furnace. So the music plays and everyone bows, except for three: Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And yes, their courage is remarkable, but also their clarity. They know who their God is. They know the commandments. They could respect and even work for the king, but they could also say, I draw a line here. Now you're coming into my religious faith. They wanted to live faithfully within their culture, but you can't always let the culture tell you who you are and what you should believe. So when Jesus comes along, Rome is the next Babylon, the next empire that is controlling people's lives. And here in Matthew 22, Jesus' opponents think, we've got the perfect trap. We're going to get him. We're going to ask him if you should pay your taxes or not. And if he says no, we'll have him arrested for inciting insurrection. But if he says no, don't pay your if he says yes, pay your taxes, then the crowd's going to look at him as just another tool of the establishment, and he'll lose credibility. So then Jesus asks, does someone have a Roman coin? Now, when he does that, he's pointing something out. He has no coins. But the Pharisees, they have a denarii, and they pull one out. So he's already shown who's on the side of wealth and power, who's holding the king's coin, right? And then he says, whose image is on that coin? And it's not just that there's a picture of Tiberius Caesar. There's an inscription on the coin. It says, Tiberius Caesar, son of the divine Augustus. And you flip over the coin, and on the other side it says, Pontiff Maxim, high priest. Caesar is the high priest of the Roman gods. It says so right on the coin, like ours say, in God we trust. Everyone watching knows that possessing that coin breaks the first two commandments. No other God before me, and no graven images of God. The temple leaders know this because they actually don't allow Roman denarii into the temple. You come to the temple and you change your money and you take your Roman denarii and you get good Jewish shekels for them at a nice, reasonable fee, of course. Oh, and remember Jesus turning over the table of the money changers? That was the previous chapter. That was one day ago. And so Jesus is making it really clear how he feels not only about Roman coins, but Jewish ones as well, that you shouldn't love either one too much. So Jesus has made his point already without answering the questions. And the subtlety here of saying whose image is on the coin, it puts us back also to the Genesis story of creation. God creates human beings in the divine image, male and female, all of us created in the image of the divine, not just Caesar, but every single one of us and your neighbor. So when he asks, what's the image on the coin, he's also undermining Caesar's claim of divine superiority. And the classic translation says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And the underlying Greek is closer to give back to Caesar what is Caesar's. What does that mean? You notice Jesus never really answers the question about taxes one way or the other. He's changed the question. It's not, should you pay your taxes, but who do you belong to? Whose image is stamped on you? Caesar's image is on the coin. Give it back to him. But God's image is stamped on you. From the beginning, that's the deepest truth about every human being. Before you were an American, before you joined a political party, before you held any opinions or cast a vote, you were created in the image of God. And so is your neighbor. And that means our first allegiance is never to our Caesars. We can pray for our country and our leaders. We can love our country. We can seek the welfare of our community. But we can't give to Caesar what belongs to God. And that's why Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego remained standing when everyone else bowed. That is why Jesus stood before Pilate. And that is our calling as well, not to withdraw from the world, but not to worship it either, but to be within it, remembering who we are and the dignity and well-being of everyone else too. When a government decides some people bear less of the image of God than others, the church cannot be silent. Sometimes we have to name Caesar's idolatry, and that's not being political. That's remembering Genesis and the prophets and the Sermon on the Mount. Whenever the king's music begins to play and everyone else starts bowing, remember whose image is stamped on you. Because it is that image, not Caesar's, that claims you, that defines you, that fills you full of love and the desire for justice, to love your neighbor and even your enemies, and to seek the kind of well-being that God would hope for us. Amen.